March 15, 2026, 2:47 p.m. local time, Mar-a-Lago Golf Club, Palm Beach, Florida. Donald Trump lines up his approach shot on the 14th hole. At that exact moment, 247 miles southwest in Mexico City, President Claudia Sheinbaum puts her signature on a document that shatters 32 years of North American economic integration. The $95 billion BRICS partnership agreement gets signed while Trump's golf ball lands in the sand trap. Here's what the media won't tell you. This wasn't about trade diversification or economic opportunity. This was about survival. 3 days earlier, Trump had threatened Mexico with 35% tariffs on all exports unless they agreed to pay for border wall construction retroactively, $47 billion over 10 years. Mexico's response wasn't a diplomatic protest. It was this meeting in Mexico City with BRICS representatives that changes everything about how power works in this hemisphere. Let me walk you through what actually happened, minute by minute, because the timing reveals the coordination that took 18 months to execute. The official story sounds routine. Mexico joins BRICS to expand trade opportunities, diversify economic partnerships, strengthen South-South cooperation, standard diplomatic language about mutual benefit and shared prosperity. But when you track the money flows, the timeline, and who was in that Mexico City room, you realize what this actually represents. This is the first time in 200 years that a country sharing a border with the United States has formally joined an economic bloc designed to circumvent American financial systems. The Monroe Doctrine just died, and it happened while Trump was working on his short game. March 12, 2026, 11:23 a.m. Eastern. Trump posts on Truth Social. Mexico will pay $47 billion for the wall they should have funded years ago. 35% tariffs start April 1st unless they agree. No exceptions. That's the trigger. March 13th, 9:15 a.m. Mexico City time. Emergency cabinet meeting. Finance Minister Rogelio Ramirez presents 3 options: pay Trump's demand and face domestic political crisis, reject and face economic devastation from tariffs, or activate the contingency plan they've been developing since October 2024. March 14th, 6:30 p.m. Moscow time. Russia's Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak lands in Mexico City on an unscheduled diplomatic flight. Brazilian Trade Minister Carlos Favaro arrives 2 hours later from São Paulo. Chinese Commerce Ministry representative Liu Wei touches down at 11:45 p.m. By midnight, 4 BRICS representatives are in Mexico City for what was announced as routine trade consultations. But here's what nobody reported. At 1:15 a.m., a 5th plane lands in Mexico City. No diplomatic markings. Inside, Mohammed bin Salman's economic advisor with authorization for $12 billion in Saudi energy financing. The Saudis weren't officially joining the meeting, but their money was. March 15th, 6:45 a.m. Emergency session begins at Los Pinos presidential residence. Not in the main conference room, in the secure communications facility designed for national security briefings. Present: President Sheinbaum, Finance Minister Ramirez, Foreign Secretary Alicia Bárcena, and Central Bank Governor Victoria Rodriguez Ceja. Also present via encrypted video, Reserve Bank of India Governor, People's Bank of China Deputy Governor, and Russian Central Bank First Deputy Governor. The agenda wasn't trade promotion, it was financial architecture. At 8:30 a.m., they activate Mexico's contingency plan, Operación Independencia, developed since October 2024, when Trump's election became probable. The plan's assumption: any Trump second term would attempt economic subjugation through tariff warfare. The response: create dollar exit ramps before threats materialized. By 11 a.m., they finalized technical specifications for peso-yuan swap arrangements. Mexico's central bank commits to maintaining $8.5 billion in yuan reserves by December 2026. China's central bank reciprocates with 8.5 billion peso reserves. Direct currency trading starts bypassing New York clearing systems by August 2026. March 15th, 2:47 p.m. Eastern, Trump tees off at Mar-a-Lago. Same minute, Sheinbaum signs the preliminary BRICS partnership framework. The document commits Mexico to $95 billion in trade flows over 7 years, $34 billion in energy infrastructure investments from Russia, $28 billion in manufacturing partnerships with China, $18 billion in agricultural trade with Brazil, $15 billion in technology transfers and financial services integration. But here's the part that changes everything. Buried in Article 47, subsection C. All bilateral trade settlements between BRICS members and Mexico shall be conducted in local currencies, or yuan, with dollar settlements limited to third-party transactions requiring conversion. Translation: Mexico just agreed to bypass the dollar for $95 billion in annual trade by 2030. Article 52 reveals the enforcement mechanism. Mexico establishes yuan clearing banks in Tijuana, Guadalajara, and Monterrey. By November 2026, Chinese state banks provide $4.2 billion in trade financing for Mexican companies transitioning away from dollar invoicing. Russian energy giant Gazprom offers peso-ruble payment systems for natural gas imports, cutting energy costs by 18% compared to dollar-denominated contracts. Article 61 contains the sovereignty clause that makes reversal nearly impossible. If Mexico faces economic coercion from non-BRICS members, obviously targeting U.S. tariff threats, BRICS partners commit to increasing trade volumes by 25% above baseline projections. Essentially, the harder Trump squeezes, the faster Mexico integrates with BRICS systems. The immediate market reaction tells you everything. Mexican peso strengthens 2.3% against the dollar within 6 hours of signing. That's $11 billion in foreign exchange gains overnight. Meanwhile, shares of U.S. companies doing business in Mexico drop. Caterpillar down 4.2%, John Deere down 3.8%, General Motors down 5.1%. But here's what most analysts missed. Shares of Chinese companies with Mexican operations surge. BYD up 7.3%, CRRC Corporation up 6.8%, China Communications Construction up 5.9%. Capital markets are pricing in the new reality before politicians understand what happened. Pause for a second. When a country that sends 83% of its exports to the United States formally joins an anti-dollar trading bloc, that's not diversification, that's choosing sides. Now let me show you who actually orchestrated this, because the financial architecture reveals something much bigger than Mexican independence. Russia needed a North American foothold after 2 years of Western sanctions. China needed to crack the U.S. economic sphere in its own hemisphere. Brazil needed a manufacturing partner for its industrial expansion. Mexico needed protection from Trump's economic warfare. All 4 interests converged on one solution: formalize Mexico's integration into non-dollar trade systems. The genius of the timing lies in the impossible position it creates for Washington. Trump can follow through on tariff threats, which pushes Mexico deeper into BRICS partnerships and makes the dollar bypass permanent. Or he can back down, which signals that threatening BRICS members carries no consequences. Either way, American leverage decreases. This follows a pattern that's been accelerating since 2022. Saudi Arabia discussing oil sales in yuan, India paying for Russian energy in rupees, China and Brazil eliminating dollar intermediation for bilateral trade. Each bilateral agreement creates precedent for the next one. Mexico's decision means every Latin American country now has a proven template for reducing dollar dependence. The cascade effect starts immediately. Within 72 hours of Mexico's signing, Colombia announced preliminary discussions with BRICS representatives. Venezuela, already isolated by U.S. sanctions, accelerated yuan adoption for oil sales. Argentina's government issued statements about exploring alternative trade mechanisms. But the real domino falls 96 hours later. March 19th, Colombian President Gustavo Petro meets privately with Chinese Ambassador Lan Hu. March 20th, Colombia considering BRICS observer status. March 21st, Lula calls Petro personally. March 22nd, Lavrov schedules routine diplomatic visit to Bogotá for April 15th. The template spreads faster than Washington can respond to it. March 25th brings the real shock. Justin Trudeau, facing Trump's threats about making Canada the 51st state, authorizes Trade Minister Mary Ng to explore all available partnerships for Canadian economic security. March 26th, China's ambassador to Canada requests urgent meeting with Foreign Affairs. March 27th, Chinese state media publishes Northern Neighbor Seeks New Horizons, diplomatic signal that Beijing is receptive to Canadian outreach. By month's end, every country in the Western Hemisphere except the United States is either in BRICS, applying to BRICS, or publicly discussing BRICS partnership options. This isn't 5 separate countries making independent decisions. This is systematic dollar displacement happening in real time, coordinated through Chinese economic diplomacy that took 3 years to position correctly. The numbers show the structural consequences. Mexico represents $496 billion in annual U.S. trade. If even 30% of that shifts to non-dollar settlement over 3 years, that's $148 billion in reduced dollar demand annually. Applied across Latin America, we're looking at $400 billion in trade flows, exiting dollar systems by 2029. When countries don't need dollars for trade, they don't need dollar reserves. When they don't need dollar reserves, they sell U.S. treasuries. Treasury prices drop, yields spike, U.S. borrowing costs rise. The $38 trillion national debt becomes more expensive to service every quarter. Here's the historical parallel that matters. In 1971, Charles de Gaulle called the dollar system an exorbitant privilege and started converting French dollar reserves to gold. Nixon responded by closing the gold window, ending Bretton Woods overnight. But France was across an ocean and represented 4% of global GDP. Mexico is across a 1,054-mile border and represents the 12th largest economy. When your immediate neighbor joins a currency bloc designed to bypass your financial system, geography becomes destiny. But there's a deeper parallel that terrifies Washington strategists. In 1823, the Monroe Doctrine declared the Western Hemisphere off limits to European powers. The doctrine worked for 200 years because no alternative system offered comparable benefits to American partnership. Countries chose the U.S. not from loyalty, but from incentive. BRICS changes the incentive structure permanently. Chinese development financing comes without democracy requirements. Russian energy comes at 20–30% discounts to market prices. Brazilian trade partnerships don't require environmental compliance audits. Indian technology transfers don't include intellectual property restrictions. The United States offers military protection, debt-financed consumption, and regulatory oversight. China offers infrastructure investment, resource partnerships, and sovereignty respect. When countries face that choice, geography stops determining destiny. The Mexican decision creates 3 immediate problems for U.S. strategy. First, it proves that threatening BRICS members accelerates their integration, rather than deterring it. Second, it establishes precedent for other border nations. Canada now has a working model if Trump follows through on statehood threats. Third, it demonstrates that the Monroe Doctrine is unenforceable when backed only by economic threats, rather than military intervention. Now watch who actually wins and loses from Mexico's pivot, because the redistribution of leverage happens faster than anyone anticipated. China gains immediate access to North American manufacturing supply chains without tariff barriers. Chinese electric vehicle exports to Mexico increased from 2,147 units in 2025 to projected 85,000 units by 2027. Chinese lithium processing facilities in Mexico bypass U.S. critical mineral restrictions. Russia secures energy market diversification that sanctions couldn't prevent. Mexican refined petroleum imports from Russia increase from zero in 2025 to projected 8.2 billion annually by 2028. Russian agricultural exports to Mexico grow 340% over baseline. Brazil gets manufacturing scale that domestic market alone couldn't support. Brazilian steel exports to Mexico increase 280% under BRICS partnership terms. Brazilian aerospace technology transfers accelerate Mexican aerospace industry development. Brazilian banks establish Mexican operations, providing project financing in reais instead of dollars. India expands generic pharmaceutical exports to Mexican market without FDA equivalent restrictions. Indian IT services gain Mexican telecommunications market access. Indian renewable energy technology transfers support Mexico's energy independence goals. The United States loses more than trade volume. America loses the assumption of hemispheric economic dominance. Trump has two options, both bad. Military intervention in Mexico to reverse BRICS integration triggers immediate hemispheric crisis, destroys remaining U.S. soft power, and creates permanent security threat on the southern border. Acceptance of Mexican BRICS membership signals that geographic proximity no longer guarantees U.S. economic dominance. The empire's fundamental assumption just broke, that countries in the American sphere have no alternative to dollar-based systems. What this means for your daily life becomes clear when you track the consequences. When Mexico reduces dollar usage, it reduces dollar demand. Reduced demand means reduced purchasing power for dollars. Your savings buy less. Your imports cost more. If dollar trade settlement drops from current 58% to 40% over 5 years, conservative estimates suggest 15 to 20% reduction in dollar purchasing power. Your $100,000 in savings buys what $80,000, $85,000 buys today. Your $4 gallon of gas becomes $4.80. Your $400 monthly grocery bill becomes $480, $500. Interest rates spike when foreign central banks sell treasuries. Your mortgage at current 6.5% becomes 8 to 9% on a $400,000 home. That's $600, $800 more per month for 30 years. But here's the deeper structural change. For 80 years, being America's neighbor meant automatic economic integration. Mexico just proved that geographic destiny is optional when alternative systems exist. The timeline accelerates from here. By June 2026, first yuan peso direct trading mechanisms go live. Mexican banks start offering yuan deposits to businesses trading with China. By September, China opens its first development bank branch in Mexico City, providing project financing without dollar conversion. By December 2026, the infrastructure becomes self-reinforcing. Every Mexican company that trades in yuan needs yuan reserves. Every yuan transaction reduces dollar velocity. Every BRICS partnership creates incentive for the next one. But here are the 3 scenarios for how this plays out, because the trajectory isn't linear. Scenario 1, controlled fragmentation, probability 45%. Trump accepts Mexican BRICS membership as fait accompli but imposes selective tariffs on Chinese goods transshipped through Mexico. Mexico responds by routing Chinese imports through Brazilian and Russian partnerships instead. Dollar trade settlement in Latin America drops to 60% by 2028, 45% by 2030. U.S. maintains security partnerships but loses economic hegemony gradually. Your life changes slowly. Inflation increases 2 to 3% annually above normal rates. Import prices rise 15 to 20% over 5 years. Interest rates increase 1-2 percentage points as Treasury demand decreases. Painful but manageable adjustment. Scenario 2, sudden rupture. Probability 35%. Trump attempts economic coercion of Mexico through comprehensive sanctions, triggering BRICS Article 61 sovereignty clause. China, Russia, Brazil, and India increase Mexican trade by 25% immediately, providing $126 billion in alternative market access overnight. Other Latin American countries join BRICS en masse for protection. Dollar trade settlement collapses below 40% within 18 months. Treasury sell-off accelerates. Federal Reserve forced to monetize debt at unprecedented scale. Your savings lose 30 to 40% purchasing power within 2 years. Mortgage rates spike to 12 to 15%. Import-dependent industries shed millions of jobs. Social crisis follows economic crisis. Scenario 3. Negotiated coexistence. Probability 20%. Washington recognizes that military intervention in Mexico is impossible. Economic coercion counterproductive. Formal agreement allows Mexican BRICS membership with U.S. security partnership continuation. Two-track system. Security through Washington, economics through Beijing. Requires unprecedented U.S. strategic humility. Least likely given current political dynamics. The wild cards that could change everything. Saudi Arabia announces oil sales in yuan within 90 days. Probability 25%. If this happens, every oil importing nation needs yuan reserves immediately. Mexican BRICS membership becomes template for global energy trade restructuring. Canada formally applies for BRICS partnership by year-end. Probability 40%. If both North American neighbors join Chinese economic bloc, U.S. isolation in its own hemisphere becomes irreversible. China invades Taiwan before U.S. can respond to Mexican crisis. Probability unknown but rising. Military conflict overrides economic considerations. BRICS partnerships become wartime alliances. European Union announces yuan trade settlement mechanisms for China trade. Probability 30%. If Europe follows Mexico's template, dollar system faces coordinated challenge on 3 continents simultaneously. The breaking point comes when other border nations realize Mexico succeeded. Canada faces similar Trump threats about statehood and resource extraction. If Canada follows Mexico's template, U.S. economic isolation in its own hemisphere becomes mathematically irreversible. We're watching the end of the assumption that geography equals loyalty. Mexico just demonstrated that when forced to choose between domestic sovereignty and American partnership, sovereignty wins. The $95 billion BRICS partnership signed while Trump played golf represents the moment America's backyard became contested territory. The Monroe Doctrine survived 2 world wars, the Cold War, and the rise of China. It died on a golf course in Palm Beach while the president worked on his sand trap technique. Math doesn't care about American exceptionalism. When your neighbor joins your rival's economic bloc, proximity stops being privilege and starts being vulnerability.